Welcome to Pilates Elephants. I'm your host, Raphael Bender. I'm going to make a case today for why we should encourage our clients to flex their spine under load, and why you should do it and why I do it. This seems like a crazy heretical statement to make in 2025 in the Pilates world. But with a little bit of a broader context and a bit of a historical context, it's a completely unremarkable thing to suggest. Right now, there's a little bit of a trope or a meme going around where there's on social media where there's a Pilates instructor. Oh, you're a Pilates instructor, you've just murdered somebody and you're disposing of the body. And you're dragging the body across the floor, and your Pilates instructor sees you and says, do it with neutral spine. And then everybody's, ha, 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 Pilates is all about neutral spine. Well, here's the thing, dear listener. This wasn't always the case. So I'm going to read to you from the book Pilates, Return to Life Through Contrology, published in 1945 by Joseph Pilates. Page 17, he says, quote, "Therefore, in the reclining exercises, be sure wherever indicated to keep your back full length always pressed firmly against the mat or floor." End quote. So in other words, press your low back, because when you lie on the mat, on your back, like your middle back presses into the mat automatically. You don't have to make any attempt to do that. Whereas your low back, naturally, for most of us, doesn't press into the mat. So he's instructing us to press our back full length into the mat or floor, which means really particularly focusing on the lower back and pressing the lower back into the mat or floor. And Joseph's idea of ideal posture was to have the spine perfectly straight, which we would now technically call lumbar flexion and slight thoracic extension. So Joseph was strongly in favour of flexing the low back during Pilates. In fact, it was a standing instruction in all of his exercise. So it wasn't always the case that Pilates was synonymous with neutral spine. It came into Pilates, neutral spine came into Pilates in the sort of late 1990s, early 2000s, when the contemporary Pilates movement was in full swing, and they incorporated, they being the leaders of the contemporary Pilates movement. So the people that were at the head of those organisations, for example, Moira Merrithew or Moira Stott at Stott Pilates, and Brent Anderson at Polestar, Rael Iskowitz at Bassi, etc., were pioneering this kind of next wave of Pilates after the classical Pilates era in the kind of 1990s, early 2000s, and they were solidifying and formalising their teacher training programs. Up until then, there had been teacher training programs, but they were very informal. Moira Stott told us when I was there training with her, doing my instructor trainer certification at Toronto, she told us a story that when she did her certification with Romana, there wasn't any organisation to it. It was just a bunch of different kind of photocopied handouts that Romana kind of seemingly sort of cobbled together on the spot, and it was just basically Romana sharing her experience and her knowledge, essentially freestyle. There was no actual structured program. And so that was sort of in the 1980s when, Romana was doing that. And then in the late 90s, early 2000s, when the next generation, the people that Romana had trained and other people trained by the other kind of first generation teachers were becoming the heads, they were starting their Pilates schools, and they were formalising their curriculum, the curricula, which is a plural of curriculum. And, for example, Moira Merrithew, Moira Stott, created manuals and handbooks and a formalized curriculum of specific exercises that you learn in a specific order in the course, and, what specific way you should, the words you should use to cue every exercise, etc., and rules for programming. And so they formalized these curricula, and at the same time, many of them incorporated what was at the time current physical therapy, best practice, and exercise science into their courses. So Brent Anderson is a physical therapist, and Moira worked with physical therapists and biomechanists to create her curriculum for Stop Pilates. And at the time, in the late 1990s and early 2000s, neutral spine was all the rage in physical therapy and biomechanics. And there were, some lab experiments showing, when I say lab experiments, I mean experiments on pig cadaver spines, showing, bending spines repeatedly, thousands of times in a row, led to disc herniation. And thus this whole curriculum was constructed. And, one of the principles of Stop Pilates, the second principle, pelvic placement, was neutral spine is the safest and strongest and safest position for weight bearing and shock absorption, which turns out subsequently not to be true. And so now we have, in 2025, a quarter of a century later, quite a large amount of evidence showing that neutral spine is not the safest and strongest position for load bearing and shock absorption. If anything, it is the weakest and least efficient position for weight bearing and shock absorption. And there is no detectable difference in injury risk in different spinal positions. So I'm going to give you a little brief overview of the science, and then just also talk about just some plain logic. I'm not going to go too deep into the science because I've gone deep into the science on this in a previous episode 192 with Natalie Wilson, Neutral Imprint. But just briefly, there was a systematic review in 2020 by Roffey et al., which is a review of multiple studies. And in this study, in this systematic review by Roffey et al. In 2020, they looked at the association between awkward work postures and low back pain. And by awkward work postures, they don't mean like lordosis, kyphosis, or flat back or sway back. What they mean is leaning over a machine at an awkward angle for a prolonged period of time. By they mean posture in a much more global sense than in the specific kind of posture assessment, posture analysis, posture types we mean in Pilates. They mean it to be just a body position. And so they're looking at the association between awkward work postures, where people are, hunched over some machine or something in some very awkward position for a prolonged period of time, with or without vibration, or when people have to lift things repeatedly in an awkward angle, at an awkward angle in their work. And what they found was in fact, I'll just read from the conclusion, quote, "There was strong evidence from 6 high-quality studies that there was no association between awkward work postures and low back pain. Similarly, there was strong evidence from 3 high-quality studies that there was no temporal relationship." Quote, "It is therefore unlikely that awkward occupational postures are independently causative of low back pain in the populations of workers studied," end quote. And, this is from 2010, my apologies. And so if people can endure awkward work postures, bent and twisted over some kind of weird machine in a factory or something for hours, with a strong evidence that it doesn't cause low back pain, well, how is sitting in 5 degrees of lumbar flexion going to cause low back pain? So that's one piece of science. Now there's lots of science on this, and in that episode 192, I go deep down the rabbit hole in the science. But there's just one other, and this is the one I was thinking of from 2020. It's called To Flex or Not to Flex. Is there a relationship between lumbar spine flexion during lifting and low back pain? A systematic review with meta-analysis by Seracini et al. From 2020. And what they found was, quote, there was low-quality evidence that greater lumbar spine flexion during lifting was not a risk factor for low back pain onset or persistence, or a differentiator of people with and without low back pain, end quote. So in other words, there's only low-quality evidence, but the evidence points in the direction of it not being associated. Now, if there was a strong association, you would expect that it would have shown it may be low-quality evidence that there is an association. So it seems very unlikely at this point that low back pain is caused by lumbar flexion during lifting. Now, there's a lot of other biomechanical studies that I went into in episode 192. So if you want to go back and review those. But we do have quite a bit of evidence that flexing your low back doesn't cause injury, doesn't cause low back pain, doesn't cause low back pain to become worse, it doesn't cause low back pain to persist. And there's no difference in the amount of lumbar spine flexion in people with and without low back pain in general, but in lifting, and there is another study which I quoted in that episode 192, that actually people with low back pain lift with less spine flexion than people without low back pain. So I'm going to leave the science there and move on, but suffice it to say that the science has moved on, dear listener, in the last quarter of a century, as you would gosh darn well hope it would. And if you think about, what the technology has moved on in the last 25 years, in the year 2000, there were no iPhones, dear listener. You were on a flip phone. You were on a Nokia 3310 in the year 2000. And this is when these Pilates curriculums from these contemporary Pilates organisations were being developed, and this is when neutral spine was the current science. This is when Stuart McGill's book, Low Back Pain, Evidence-Based Prevention and Rehabilitation, was published, I think, 1999 or 1998, something like that. So this was the current kind of zeitgeist, the sort of thought bubble that the Pilates and fitness and rehab worlds were living in the year 2000 was neutral spine, but we've moved on. So it's now no longer current science, and I think it's becoming increasingly well accepted amongst researchers that it's just not a thing anymore. And yet it persists in Pilates, and hence the meme of dragging the body across the floor in your Pilates studio. Pilates instructor tuts you for doing it without having a neutral spine. But just now, I just want to think about just plain logic here, dear listener. So there is ample science on this, but let's just think about common sense. Think of any other joint in the body and think about how to make that stronger. So think about the elbow, the knee, the hip, the ankle, the shoulder. What do you do to those joints when you want to strengthen them? You move them through full range. Want to strengthen your hamstrings? What do? Knee curls. Strengthen your quads? Knee extensions. Strengthen your glutes? Hip extensions. Strengthen your hip flexors? Hip flexion. Strengthen your hip abductors? What do? Hip abduction. Strengthen your hip adductors? What do? Hip adduction. If you want to strengthen your forearm flexors, you do wrist curls. Forearm extensors, you do wrist extensions. If you want to strengthen your calves, you do plantar flexion. If you want to strengthen your tibialis anterior, you do dorsiflexion. If you want to strengthen your shoulder abductors, you do shoulder abduction. Shoulder flexors, you do shoulder flexion. But then when it comes to the spine, when we just want to strengthen the spinal flexors, what do? Keep it neutral at all times. It just doesn't make sense, dear listener. When we want to strengthen any other joint in the body, we don't seem to think twice, and we assume, in fact, we prioritize moving through full range. Think about the hips and the knees and the shoulders. We try. Look at all of the therapeutic exercises that you see for shoulders, for example, on the interwebs. You see people lying on their tummy, squeezing their shoulder blades together, lifting their arms up, doing Supermans and things like that. Doing, Y exercises and T exercises. We're moving the shoulders through their end range of there to strengthen those muscles as a preventative and rehabilitation strategy. And yet when it comes to the spine, it's the exact opposite. We have to keep it neutral. It just doesn't make sense. There's absolutely no logic. And why is that? Well, there is no why. The why is because in the year 2000, it was all the vogue in the physical therapy and biomechanics world based on the research that we did have at the time. And that was baked into the curricula of all of the current crop of contemporary Pilates educators. And they haven't changed their curricula since the year 2000, dear listener. And that's why they're still teaching it, because they've got 10,000 Pilates manuals and in trainers and courses running, and it's all based around this neutral spine stuff. And so to change that is just too big of an unwieldy beast for them to actually change it. So they just keep teaching it, even though it's not true. Well, dear listener, I hope that empowers you to cast off the shackles of neutral spine. And if you want further inspiration, pick up this book, Return to Life Through Contrology by Joseph Pilates. I've got the white edition with the Joseph Pilates in his t-shirt picture on the front. And in that edition, it's page 17, where he says, therefore, in reclining exercises, be sure wherever indicated to keep your back full length, always pressed firmly against the mat or floor. But if you, on the other hand, have the Pilates Return to Life Through Contrology, the revised for the 21st century edition with the blue cover with the fireworks and then the picture of Joseph, then it's on a slightly different page because there's a bit of a longer forward in that one. So everything's a few pages further back. So in the blue edition, it's on page 34 where he says, therefore, in the reclining exercises, be sure wherever indicated to keep your back full length, always pressed firmly against the mat or floor. Plus, dear listener, science has moved on in the last quarter century, and so should we. So let that be, let this be the moments where you become liberated from neutral spine and not even worrying about it. In fact, let this be the moment where you encourage your clients to flex their spine by pressing their body and their spine full length against the mat or floor in the supine exercises, and even perhaps in planks, because you can actually bias the lower abs by doing a posterior pelvic tilt. And who doesn't want to work on their lower abs? All right, dear listener, I hope you found this helpful. And I'll link to a couple of those studies underneath in the show notes. But if you want a much more exhaustive tour through the science, go back and listen to episode 192 of this podcast. All right, much love, and I'll see you in the next one.